So we actually got started, we made our first batch of chocolate in January 2016. However, the idea to actually make chocolate came to us in August of 2014. And so both Priscilla and I, we have a background in international relations and French. So we didn't study anything related to what we're now doing. And so how the idea came to us is both of us thought we wanted to be in the nonprofit sector, so we wanted to work in development. But in some way, in doing 57, we are still in development. And so we were both working in Switzerland at the time. I was working in women in education, Priscilla was working in food security, and we both began to be quite restless, being at a desk 9 to 5. And our dad, he's very big on entrepreneurship, very patriotic. We're both Ghanaians, by the way, though we sound very American. We grew up in Senegal, however we schooled in the States, but we are fully Ghanaian. And so our dad began to speak to us about entrepreneurship, and he told us that he would be retiring soon and moving back to Ghana, and that we should consider starting a business. And at the time, honestly, I don't think either of us really knew what it meant or what it took to become an entrepreneur, but it sounded fancy and cool and liberating. So we were like, you know what, why not? And so we agreed that when our dad would retire, we would resign and plan to move back to Ghana. And so about 3 to 5 months later, our dad did retire, and so we both resigned and began to make the move. And what a lot of people don't know is that the idea actually came like literally probably a week or two before we actually came to Ghana, and we were invited by friends to visit a chocolate factory in Switzerland, sort of as a last, fun thing to do before we leave the country. And that chocolate factory was called Caille, one of the largest in Switzerland. And the minute you enter the factory, there's a display room of where they source all their beans from. And the two largest displays, you can guess, were Côte d'Ivoire and Ghana. And so that really hit us in that moment that, wow, Switzerland is known as the chocolate nation of the world. You say Swiss, people automatically associate Switzerland with chocolate. It's not the same thing with any African country. When you think of Ghana, you don't necessarily think of chocolate. You may think of cocoa, but you don't think about chocolate. And so when we realized that Switzerland doesn't grow cocoa, and what's interesting though is the groups that we've had here, a lot of people don't know that cocoa comes from West Africa or South America or Southeast Asia. A lot of people think, when we ask what are the major cocoa growing regions in the world, quite a number of people who have come here automatically say Switzerland or France, or because that's where the chocolate is. That's where people associate chocolate with. And so it really hit us in that moment that, wow, Ghana and Côte d'Ivoire, we have this resource, yet we're not even known for the finished good. We're not known to add value to it. And so that's where the idea came, and we decided that we wanted to come back to Ghana and add value to the local resource, because at the time, in 2014, there was probably one, honestly, major chocolate here, which I'm sure you guys have all heard of, Golden Tree by CPC, Cocoa Processing Company. And that was it. Meanwhile, you go to Switzerland, you have brands left and right. The States, you have different brands left and right. And we wanted to change that by creating a brand that would be recognizable, a brand that could compete not only in Ghana, but globally as well. And so the name 57 is short for 1957, which was Ghana's independence. However, it's not just about being free from colonial rule. It's more about the spirit that was behind 1957. So under Kwame Nkrumah's leadership, what a lot of people have forgotten today.
Who's Kwame Nkrumah?
So Kwame Nkrumah was the first president of Ghana. So under his leadership, a lot of people have forgotten today that during his leadership, the country was actually manufacturing. And so we had a lot of industries. So for example, textile industries, the textile you see here today, we were making it in country. Today it's primarily produced in Indonesia and China, even the Netherlands actually, Velisco manufactures textile, African textile. We had a thriving dairy industry. Today, dairy in this country is non-existent. However, in the 1957 period, we were producing our own dairy. We had our own dairy farms. But once again, after Kwame Nkrumah's overthrow, that ceased. We had tomato processing factories. Today, we import the majority of our tomatoes. There were the Bogatanga rice mills. Today, Ghana imports 60% of the rice it consumes, so we can grow rice. And what's even more shocking is probably now going on 4 years. There's a state-of-the-art sugar processing plant, the Canada factory, and it has never been used. For the last 4 years, it's been empty. And the reason is there's not enough sugar cane to power the plant. And so for us, we wanted to add value, and we wanted to say, okay, starting with cocoa, we can make chocolate, we can add value to a local resource, because the truth is, yes, cocoa is valuable, but there's more value in a finished good, and the money would be kept here in country if we would actually process it fully here. And that's why it's shocking to see that, you have a lot of large companies here like Berry Callebaut, Touton, Kajid, you name it, they're all here processing their goods into semi-finished products, shipping it back to Europe to manufacture it into chocolate, and of course, the chocolate will enter this market. And where does the money go? The money goes to Europe, and the money doesn't stay here. So we wanted to change that. So that's why we named it 57. So once again, we were founded, so we made our first batch of chocolate in January 2016, but we were officially incorporated in February of 2016. And so our vision is to be the most positively impactful manufacturer across Africa to drive development and self-sufficiency on the continent. So a lot of people, and as you can see, I'm sure when you walked in, you've seen our packaging. A lot of people think that we get our packaging done in China. Our packaging actually is done fully here. As much as possible, we try and keep the work done here, because we realize that even if it's cheaper to do the work in China, which it is actually, the money doesn't stay here in Ghana. So we'd rather let the money be kept here in Ghana and help grow the economy than send it outside. And that's part of our wanting to be self-sufficient. And our mission is to add value to local resources by transforming them into high-quality, finished goods that celebrate African art and culture, and that are accessible locally and globally. So once again, we're starting with cocoa, but Ghana has a whole range of resources, and you'll see in some of the chocolates we produce that we try and incorporate local ingredients to add value to them so that people can appreciate what we have here. Because we've seen, even in moving back, that there's a huge stigma, whether consciously or unconsciously, in Africans and actually in non-Africans as well, towards made in Africa goods, in the sense that they're typically seen as lower quality, not as good, and we want to change that. We want to say, hey, in Africa we can produce quality things made by Africans, and we can consume those things and also make those things available on a larger market. And also, equally, a lot of people tend to ask us questions about free trade. We're all for free trade, but the thing is, free trade has no benefit if we're not making anything ourselves. So that would just require what's happening actually now if you go to grocery stores. Most of the grocery stores are filled with things from Britain, France, the United States, and you just have a tiny little section of things made in Ghana, and that's not how it should be. Our grocery stores should actually be filled with things made in Ghana, but today you go to grocery stores, things such as toothpicks are imported, things such as dog food are imported, tomatoes, onions, bananas, things we can grow here are all imported, and we want to change that, and that's part of our philosophy, and that's part of the things we're trying to impart into those who are working for us as well, are working with us.
May I just ask a question? But how about the comparative advantage theory? So probably in Ghana you're very efficient in producing something for the world, for example, cocoa, and it might be more efficient for you to import other products. I mean, you see that the world over. not all countries can produce everything themselves. Although a noble cause is sometimes just through efficiencies, it's better to have that trade.
I agree with that, and I understand that not every country can produce everything themselves. However, if you look at how Europe became what they are today, if you look about how China became what they are today, it all started with them manufacturing and consuming their own stuff. And so it's very a key part to us. It's almost to the extreme. We're almost not making anything. And if you go back to 1957, actually, South Korea and Ghana were economic equals. Today, South Korea is considered a developed country. Today, Ghana considered an undeveloped country. What made the difference? South Korea manufactures and consumes their own products as well, and also sells their products. And obviously, yes, they also import other things, but it's not to the extreme of where they're absolutely not making anything. But today, we're not even making televisions. We don't have our own fridge.
Nobody's making television. I mean, we are in the Netherlands also not making televisions. Nobody's making television. It's like parts are assembled in different places, even if televisions go like that.
For example.
Before Nutella is made from ingredients from, I think it was like 100 different countries. They have ingredients until it's finally assembled.
Exactly, but
It's
even you're
all the time.
assembling over there as well. That's not even happening here, you see. So I'm not saying that, oh, we should just make everything, but it's actually at a 0% where like nothing is being done.
And last question: what
yeah.
are the most important factors of the economy in Ghana? Besides, I think in the top 3 will be cacao, yeah,
Gold, and oil.
Okay,
Yeah.
so the mineral extraction,
Yeah.
just like Sierra Leone.
And even oil, we don't even own.
Yeah.
We own like maybe 5% of our oil.
Right,
Yeah.
because
So
there's
it's just
concessions
yeah.
to the foreign
Exactly.
companies.
So it's just things like
Right.
that. It's like
No,
we have
oil
the
isn't-
natural resources, but
Mineral extraction doesn't create much employment.
right.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So moving on, I'm just gonna. So another part of our philosophy is to produce a healthier brand of chocolate. If you look at the back of most chocolates, you'll see that the ingredients list, and whatever is listed first is whatever is in the majority. And so oftentimes, if you look, you'll see sugar, milk powder listed as the majority. For our milk and our dark chocolates, sugar is never the first ingredient. The first ingredient is always cocoa, because we're trying to feature the cocoa. We're not trying to just give people a quick sugar fix, but we actually want to recognize that chocolate actually is a fine flavor. It's a fine food. It's not just necessarily a candy bar. So that's what we're doing different. So it's high cocoa content, less sugar, less milk, no additives, no preservatives, no names that you can't pronounce. So a lot of chocolates use soy lecithin. We actually don't use soy lecithin in our products as well. And we're single origin sourced from one region in Ghana, which is the eastern region. So from bean to bar, and I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this, but I'll just take you guys through. So we know chocolate comes from a fruit, cocoa, and so there's 3 types, 3 main types. There's the Criollo, the Forastero, and the Trinitario. So predominantly grown here in Ghana is the Forastero. However, the government of Ghana is making the shift to produce the hybrid of the fruits, which is the cross between the Forastero and the Criollo. And so
And the Criollo or Trinitario?
the hybrid.
Yeah.
Yeah, isn't it the cross between the?
I think it's Trinitarios they're introducing, isn't it?
Yeah, it's the Trinitario.
Trinitario
Those are not
hybrid.
over here.
Yeah, no. So some people, well, actually, there are Criollos here in small
okay.
quantities.
Really?
Yes.
Great.
Yeah.
Yeah, and
Are they
actually,
preserved? That would be great.
and there's actually a movement towards creating fine flavor here.
Okay,
So there
excellent.
are available in small quantities, and
You
so
can't buy it yet.
exactly,
Yeah.
it's just not available. So now the government is making the shift towards the hybrid. So most often farmers are producing the hybrid rather than the Forastero, because I believe the hybrid gives crop in 3 years as opposed to the Forastero, which gives crop in 6 years. So it's more beneficial to the farmer. However, I've spoken to some people, and some people kind of fear that there might be a lapse on quality, but that's yet to be proven. So First thing the farmer does is the fermentation, which is stopping the bean from growing. And there are two main types of fermentation: heat fermentation and box fermentation. Heat fermentation with the banana leaves on the ground. You pour the seeds onto it, cover it, and you let it ferment for about 5 to 6 days, and the farmer rotates them occasionally. What's interesting, before I move on to box fermentation, what's interesting is something that Priscilla and I learned when we went to the Salon du Chocolat. We spoke to one of the one of the chocolate makers. I'm sure you guys know Michael Frisson. And he does something very interesting with fermentation. So he has he'll turn the beans at different points in time. So for example, he'll have a specific chocolate where he'll tell his farmers, okay, let's only turn the beans during this fermentation twice. And then for another batch of chocolate, he'll say, let's only turn the beans for the fermentation period maybe once. And we tasted the chocolate during the different turnings of fermentation. And it actually gave completely different flavors. Very unique, very interesting. And he made a remark which I thought was very key and poignant to the case of, let me just say West Africa, but Ghana. Ghana were known for the, what was the word Jack used? There's a fancy word I wanted to use, but I forget it. No, we're known for the physical quality of our bean.
Yeah.
The attribute that you most have is cocoa.
Yes.
Or chocolatey.
Exactly. So physically, it's like we're known for the chocolatey flavor, but physically our beans are of good quality, but we're not necessarily known for any fine flavor.
Right.
And fermentation can play a key part in that. But because we're so standardized, standardization isn't a bad thing, but because we're so standardized in the way we ferment our beans, the way we dry our beans, it creates just a uniform taste across almost West Africa. So if we were to switch up the way we ferment and experiment a little bit more, then we could have more unique tasting flavors. Because another example was there's a Cameroonian chocolate maker who was playing around with fermentation, and their chocolate did not taste like it came from West Africa. And just based on fermentation. So fermentation can produce a completely different tasting chocolate. And if Ghana, or let's say West Africa at large, if we want to make our chocolate known and desirable at a global level, it needs to start with the way we ferment our beans. So we need to start getting a little bit more creative and still keep the standards,
Right.
but Picasso colored outside the lines a little bit. So think of it in that term.
Would you say, Kimberly, that it's actually because of a lack of standardization that your beans don't demonstrate the attributes that they could demonstrate? Because as you said, the farmer is moving it occasionally. Yeah, farmer one does it day one, the other does it day two, some forget. And that mix of all of those beans together being fermented and dried non-uniformly creates this hodgepodge of cacao, which is pretty well dried, but it doesn't anymore give you this is much more like the Frisson way is much more setting a standard, or formulas, like this is standard 1, standard 2, you have different ways, and you document it. Would you say it's because of the pluriformity of the farmers all having their different ways of fermenting and drying that you lose your characteristics?
But cocoa, don't they say that they actually standardize it? Like they give the farmers a recommendation on how to ferment.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay, so
when,
what is the standard there? After how many days do they churn?
that's something we would have to look up.
Okay.
But yeah, so when I said standards, I meant about the systems that, for example, Cocoa Board puts in place, so that essentially this is what they recommend to the farmers. But you're right, there's also, farmers may not adhere to that. They might just do their own thing. So it's actually an issue of both. So I totally agree with that. So, yes.
Do you know what the shortest fermentation time that the people experimenting used?
That's a good question. because I've also heard of people trying it without the fermentation. So people have gone as far as to skip the whole fermentation part. But I would have to look that up.
The same guy you mentioned, Mikkel Frisholm, he's a Danish chocolate maker, a very high quality, who does all these experiments with fermentation, and he would visit your farm if he wants to work with you. But what he has one chocolate that he called bad fermentation. And why did he call it that? It's basically because he does not adhere to the standard of getting your about 80% well-fermented beans. He just says, well, I cut my fermentation short, so I don't know exactly what the shortest is that he ever did, but that would be an example of a chocolate that he produced from beans where he drastically shortened the fermentation time, just because the under-fermented beans, the violets, gave such an interesting flavor. He liked it. He said, well, actually, this is great. I don't have to follow protocol. So, all right, so if that's not, well, that's unfermented, you don't ferment it correctly. All right, I'll call it bad fermentation. So those things are happening,
yeah. So the box fermentation is, you can say that it's a lot of people in Southeast Asia and South America use box fermentation. And so they're rotated from box to box, so they give a more uniform fermentation. What's also interesting about box fermentation is that we knew a chocolate maker in Switzerland who had a farm in South America, and he got his beans, he made his batch of chocolate, and the chocolate came back tasting different. It wasn't a bad different, it was a good different. So he called up his farmers and he was like, okay, the beans that I made chocolate, it tastes different, but it's actually a very good difference. So what did you guys do differently? And they said, oh, we actually forgot to tell you, we changed the wood of the boxes. So even just like wine, what you actually ferment, the wood in which you ferment the boxes, the beans in, can actually affect the final flavor of the chocolate. And what's also interesting is, we asked people in the field, which is the better type of fermentation, heat fermentation or box fermentation. 100% said box fermentation, so we asked, well, if that's the case, why aren't farmers doing that here in Ghana? And the sad truth is, farmers just can't afford the wood for the boxes, to make the boxes.
And do you know anything about what kind of wood is best? For example, seasoned wood, through use?
I'm not too sure, but I was asking about, for example, around about, well, okay, we have an abundance of bamboo, but someone said, well, bamboo can give off a very sort of rancid feel, so you wouldn't necessarily want to have that. But I know there's a company here called AgroEco, and I actually wanted to get a booklet from them because I went to a conference and they actually spoke about a book that they had of, the best kind of trees to have as shade trees for your cocoa farm, and trees that could, possibly affect, flavor of your cocoa in a good way or in a bad way. So I'm actually supposed to email them to get that book from them. But if you Google AgroEco, I'm sure you can also email them and they can give you good information on that.
Yes, please. So I saw the box and the heat fermentation.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried to experiment in terms of taste? What that is heat fermented and that is fermented in the box?
Well, actually, that's something we're in the works of doing because we just recently acquired our own cocoa farm. So now that we have our own cocoa farm, we're now at liberty to do all these experiments that we've been wanting to do for the past 4 years. So hopefully, if you reach out to us in a year or so and ask, hey, have you tried? Then hopefully we'll be able to give you an answer for that. Okay, so from the fermenting, then we move to the drying. This process takes about 5 to 7 days. Once again, Miko Frisholm actually gave a lot of good information. I really love his chocolate, and he's a wealth of knowledge. So the drying, I'll get back to that. The drying helps remove the wetness and bitterness of the beans, make sure the beans don't get moldy, and so farmers typically use actually bamboo mats, and they dry them out in the sun for about 5 to 7 days. Miko Frisholm, who's also a chocolate maker who also experiments with the drying period. So sometimes he'll say, okay, dry them out in the sun for 2 hours, then put them away. Then the next day, 8 hours, and then put them away. And so he's found, as he said, that it can also give a different type of taste, experimenting with all parts of the drying and having. And once you experiment and you see that, you know, this works, then having that standard for the type of chocolate.
What was his name again?
Frisholm. F-R-I-S.
That name is in our presentation.
Yeah.
Okay.
So after the drying, that's when we typically step in and we purchase our beans, and we actually begin to sort them, and we sort them hand by hand. So we do this, sometimes we do this so when we purchase our beans and they're dry, just to make sure that they continue to stay fresh, we sometimes continue to dry them out in the sun for a little while. And so we hand sort our beans, essentially picking the good beans from the bad beans, and as you can see, there's little samples of beans on your table. So once we sort through our beans, then the next process is the roasting. And so large manufacturers use these huge circular roasters, but because we're a startup, we're getting to 4 years old in February, we actually just use a kitchen oven. And it actually still works quite well. What's interesting about roasting is it's another part of developing the flavor. So you can have 2 chocolate makers with the beans from the same farm, from the same tree, and solely based at the temperature and the length of time at which they roast, you can get 2 different tasting chocolates, though they may have similarities. So that's a very key part of roasting, as well as it helps remove the bacteria. However, as I'm sure you guys know, some people opt out of the roasting altogether and just start with the drying of beans in the sun, and that's known as raw chocolate. Next, once our beans are properly roasted, we then have to have the challenge of removing the skin from the beans to get the nibs. And we know of some chocolate makers who actually will peel their beans bean by bean. That takes a lot of effort and a lot of time, so we opt to crush. And so we actually have a cocoa crusher which does this. However, what we like to give people an impression of how we started. So when it was just Priscilla and I, what we would do when we were just starting up, we would literally put our roasted beans in a Ziploc bag, close the Ziploc bag, take a rolling pin, and then crush the beans that way. But now we actually have a machine that does this. So when you have the beans crushed, so these are partially crushed beans, so we would probably run this through the machine maybe about 2-3 more times. Then you can see you have a mixture of the skin and of the nibs. Now the challenge there is still separating the skin from the nibs, and this process is called winnowing. And how we do that now is we've developed a technique based on maize farmers where we use bowls and just agitation in the air, which causes the skin to fly out and the nibs to stay in the bowl. And we found that very effective, though there are machines that do this, but we found that doing it this way actually helps us to get less of the skin, because the skin, if you have too much of the husks, let me say that's the technical term, the husks or the skin in your chocolate, then that actually reduces the shelf life of your chocolate. So you want as little as possible in your chocolate. So Agnes and Portia will pass out some of the nibs for you guys to taste. And so these are roasted nibs, and I like to say they're essentially chocolate in their purest form. Some people like them this way. This way they're rich full of antioxidants, very healthy for you, lots of benefits. Some people
put them in smoothies.
Yeah, smoothies, yogurts over a
Cereal.
salad.
Yeah.
Or dessert. Yeah.
They bake with them, so they're very, very good, very nutty. Kind of reminds me of a coffee bean.
Do you sell them as well?
Not yet. We're planning on doing that in the future. So it's always interesting when we do this for kids, and they taste these. They're like, "This isn't chocolate." I'm like, "Well, this is the beginning of chocolate. It's actually the realest type of chocolate you'll taste." But yeah, so once you get the nibs, then we have our machine, which is a mélangeur or a grinder. And so stainless steel on the outside, 2 granite wheels, granite bottom, and then scrapers. And so essentially, because the nibs are about 50% cocoa butter, once you just put them in the machine and you let the machine work it up a bit, because cocoa butter melts at body temperature, then the cocoa butter and the nibs start to melt and you start to get a liquid. So that liquid essentially is known as chocolate liquor. And so once we have our chocolate liquor, we're able to then add in our other ingredients, sugar, extra cocoa butter, milk powder for making milk chocolate. And one thing that very much shocked us when we got into making chocolate is we never really knew how long it took. And so for us, in our mélangeur, it takes about 3 to 5 days, running 24 hours nonstop before it's actually ready, because we want to get the right particle size. We don't want our chocolate to be too grainy. We want to make sure the proper flavor is developed as well, and we want to make sure we're getting rid of any acid notes or any off notes as well. And so one of the major things for us has been electricity. Especially when we first started, there was something called doom store here in Ghana, where essentially we had 24 hours of power on, 24 hours of power off. So luckily we have a generator which helps us, but we also had in the beginning to get very creative about the times at which we were working. So electricity is definitely a major cost, but hopefully down the line we would hope to be off the grid completely and go solar. There's factories actually like that who are harnessing the power of the sun, like there's the Grenada chocolate factory, and I believe they are completely solar powered. So I would love to see that done here with 57 and honestly across Africa, because if you go to, if you go to the Netherlands airport, you see their solar powered buses, and we don't even have that here, but we have more sun, I believe, than the Netherlands, so we definitely need to harness the power of that which we have.
So it's the same machine for, excuse me, for